All right, welcome. So welcome everyone to the fourth webinar on the Black History Month theme for this year, which is Black Resistance, Art, Performance, and Culture. We have with us today our co-sponsors, the Virginia Beach Department of Cultural Affairs, and I'm going to turn things over in a moment to Hillary Plate, who is the Public Programming and Partnerships Manager in the Department of Cultural Affairs for the City of Virginia Beach and responsible for public programming and cultural partnerships, and is a wonderful collaborator with this project. Hillary?
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, I am just privileged to be part of Cultural Affairs for the City of Virginia Beach and working with the wonderful folks at Norfolk State University and the Princess Anne County Training School, Union Kempsville High School Alumni Association for our collaborations around these virtual discussions. I have the great privilege to collaborate with a number of distinguished leaders in our region in the area of arts, humanities, and equity, and how arts can advance equity and social justice. We started with Black History Month in 2020, partnering with Norfolk State University amid COVID. And now in season 3, we honor and learn more about the annual national theme of Black resistance through 4 different engagements. In this February, we held an oral history gathering at the Princess Anne County Training School, Union Kempsville High School Museum with Dr. Richmond, who, along with her students, produced a series of oral history interviews and documentaries. And then we followed, that event with 3 virtual events in June, September, and now December, which have become recordings and are available through the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies, as well as through the City of Virginia Beach's YouTube sites. Leading us on this journey each year are 2 women for whom I have the utmost respect and gratitude. As I introduce them each session, I feel such gratitude that I am permitted to sit amongst these incredibly intelligent and accomplished women to collaborate on such a meaningful and lasting project. Dr. Stephanie Richmond is our webinar host. She is the Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies at the Norfolk State University. She is the Project Director of the Soul Down River program funded by the Mellon Foundation and Virginia African American Cultural Center. And our moderator today is the renowned Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, Endowed Professor of Virginia Black History and Culture, Emeritus Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies, and Senior Scholar and co-founder of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University. Esteemed guests, please welcome Dr. Richmond and Dr. Newby-Alexander.
All right, so this program, as we said, is part of our ongoing series, partnering with the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs, Virginia Beach History Museums, and the Princess Anne County Training School, Union Kempsville High School Alumni and Friends Association. And you can find out more about them here. Just a quick note for webinar etiquette, please use the Q&A to ask any questions of the panelists, or if you're having an issue that I might be able to help you with. If you are having technical issues, please exit the webinar, close your browser, and then come back in. If your question is directed at a particular panelist or at our moderator, please note that in the Q&A. Keep your questions and comments short and on topic. Profanity and inappropriate comments are not permitted, and if you engage in inappropriate or uncivil behavior, you will be removed from the webinar. So thank you for joining us today. And I would like to introduce my wonderful colleague, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, who is our moderator for today's event. And just a note, this is being recorded.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for introducing everyone and the program. I'm very excited about this. And I'm going to be off camera most of the time because I want the focus to be on the screen and what we're talking about. And so thank you all so much for coming to today's program. I want to really, I guess, emphasize or connect Black resistance across the board. So we've talked about Black resistance from the historical perspective, just this whole legacy as we start from 1619 and move to the present day. And we talk about Black resistance as is being defined in the legal world, these definitions of even citizenship, of freedom, of civil rights has been such an important part of American society and culture. But so much of that definition came from African Americans in their quest to define their place and their space in American society. And we've looked at how Black resistance has manifested itself in healthcare, with so many individuals who have been, in some cases, abused by the healthcare system, but how African Americans have continued to resist and continue to redefine their role, their place in the healthcare system. And today's discussion really focuses in on how in art, in performance, and in culture in general, music, literature, when we think about poetry, when we think about jazz music, R&B, hip hop, the way in which expressions of hope and joy and solidarity and resistance to racial oppression have been such a part of the artistic display of those ideas. And so when we're thinking about art, for example, one of my favorite artists is Jacob Lawrence, and you can't go wrong with looking at his artwork as in the way that he shows how African Americans often depicted their survival strategies, the Black aesthetic, the way that Blacks define their world, define themselves, define their own beauty. And of course, art being a revolutionary statement. But one of the ways that I thought was really powerful when we talk about Black joy. So this Black resistance depicted as Black joy initially seems contradictory, but it really is not. It's when it emerges, when people live in a world that devalues them and erases their presence or their contributions, or simply dismisses those things. And so Black joy is this effective tool that allows individuals and groups to shift away from these negative narratives to events and to narratives that are in their favor. So when you look at Jacob Lawrence's Building Hope at the top, or you look at his depiction of migration. And I know that a lot of people have been trying to define the slave trade as migration, but that is a very different thing. Migration is typically a voluntary exercise, sometimes involuntary, but mostly voluntary. And so you're seeing this migration at the in the 19-teens and 20s, this depicted by Jacob Lawrence as being a way in which African Americans are redefining their space, leaving areas that were oppressive and trying to create areas that were not, and how in art he's depicting this. And of course, one of my favorite people, Harriet Tubman. I love this particular image because in it you see this hope, you see this joy where she's leading people to freedom, but you also see this aspect of resistance because she's carrying a gun and she's making sure that she's defining her space in both of those aspects, leading people to freedom and defending her right to be free and to resist this oppressive world and situation. So not to belabor this, next slide, and it's really my pleasure to introduce to you our two panelists today who are going to take this theme and really let it resonate in how we're going to be looking at fashion in particular, and also in performance. One of our first panelists is Associate Professor and my good friend Christy Frederick, who's an Associate Professor of Fashion Design at Norfolk State University. She holds a BFA in Fashion Design from Virginia Commonwealth and an MAT in Secondary Education with an emphasis on Fine Arts from Norfolk State, as well as a Master's of Fine Arts in Visual Studies from Old Dominion University and Norfolk State University's joint program. She's really the key person in the art program, focusing on fashion design with not only a specialty in textile and fashion design, but also focusing in on minority women in particular and the way that their body image is viewed by others, but more importantly, redefining how they view their body image with the idea that beauty inspires art, which inspires, of course, fashion. And she has been very instrumental in using organic and natural dye sources and botanical images in this textile surface design work that she's doing. She's exhibited her art and fashion designs in local galleries throughout Virginia, as well as beyond, and she has earned funding from the National Foundation for the Humanities, Norfolk State University's Summer Research Program, and Fashion Nova and Harlem's Fashion Row. So she is known nationally and internationally in her field. She is also juried design competitions, and she is currently adding another hat to what she does by serving as the interim program coordinator for the Division of Drama and Theater at Norfolk State. Welcome, Christy. Our next panelist is, and for those of you who know anything about Norfolk State, and the theater program, you have heard of Professor Anthony Stockard, who is a professor of drama and the founder of Norfolk State University's Drama and Theater program. He is also the artistic director of the NSU Theater Company. And every time you turn around, you are reading about awards and commendations, as well as Norfolk State's role in the theater world, both locally as well as nationally. He was named one of the 25 game changers in American theater by Black Masks magazine. He spearheaded the NSU's drama and theater program at Norfolk State University. So if it was not for him, we wouldn't even have this degree granting program. He's a two-time recipient of the Kennedy Center American College Theaters and Festivals National Awards and the winner of the HBCU Awards Best Fine Arts Program. And he hails from Alabama State University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts in Theater Arts and an MFA in Theater Arts from Brandeis University. He's also a graduate fellow in classical acting from the University of Alabama through their Alabama Shakespeare Festival. And he is a three-time recipient for excellence in directing, awarded by the Kennedy Center's American College Theater Festival. And if you haven't, hopefully you'll take the time to attend one of the incredible plays that he produces at Norfolk State. In the past, he's done Dreamgirls, Tales from Briar Patch, Thoughts, A Colored Man, The Amen Corner, A Soldier's Play, The Earth Remembers, a tribute to Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston, a tribute to Motown, Eclipsed, For Colored Girls Only Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, and Gem of the Ocean that he did for Norfolk State's 2019 Making of America program that received incredible accolades. So thank you both for participating in our webinar today, and welcome both Christy and Anthony. Next slide. So we're just going to dive in, and I want both of them to dive into this first question for me. And that question, and I'll go with ladies first, and then we'll move to Anthony. But this question has to do with the role that Black resistance has played in American society for African Americans. And exactly how did this role translate into this emerging, not just African American culture, but American culture? How did it translate? So Christy, I know you're on the hot seat now, so I'm going to start with you first.
Okay, and first of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it, Cassandra. Looking at the question, one of the first things I thought for African Americans, the resistance helped them define their place in America. You know, historically, we didn't come here looking for a better life or whatever. We were brought here, you know, under horrible circumstances, in chains and so forth. But once freed, and, you know, generations later, resistance was a way of sort of defining who I am here. I'm here now, so where do I fit? And I have to think about all that I've been told I am, and it doesn't fit. So how do I define me? And one of the first ways that tends to happen for individuals is clothing. You know, I want to be unique. I want to be uniquely me. So the clothing had to speak to who we were. I always tell my students, when, you know, historically, when you were born, is it pink or blue? Is it a boy or a girl? If you're a girl, they start to put you in pink, little dresses or onesies or whatever. For boys, it's blue. Well, with a culture, it's not as simple as that, because they also have to look at what they're going to reach back to. You know, so who am I? What do I know about my real culture? Is it African? Is it American? Is it a mixture of both? So I think that by trying to conform but not conform, that's one of the first ways that resistance started to play a role for African Americans in American society, where clothing is considered. How they started to have their own unique style, merging hints from Africa, from different countries in Africa, and blending it with, in many cases, what the mainstream is wearing, but always putting our spin on it as African Americans.
Thank you so much, Christy. What about you, Anthony? What role has resistance played in your mind in American society for African Americans?
To be African American would be to, I mean, of course, you would know, and any other historian, that you have to go back to Africa, to the origins. And when you talk about resistance, you're talking about something that's triggered by dissatisfaction or self-preservation, right? So you'd have to go all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade, of course, and documented historical proof that slaves revolted, that they would rather take their own lives and jump into the water than to come over. We talk about those things, but they planted seeds in the oppressor that resistance is not something that happens just because you're the one in power. that the people who they enslaved from Africa saw what it was, even if they couldn't speak the language. And some people just, there was initial resistance. And those stories and those moments came across the Atlantic. And even though language was not shared in English, and of course, just like we see in the pandemic, right? 3 years of separation, a lot of culture was erased in institutions and in places, and it's being rebuilt. And we see how hard that is. And that's just from having to stay in your house and not interact socially. So to have your entire culture erased from you intentionally so, and not being able to read would be the origins of where resistance came from, and that those stories came across the water with those who could still speak from their tongue, or knew or remembered or learned basic English after coming here. They were able to pick up and remind people and inspire people of those stories of people who did not accept said treatment. And that, of course, came into America once we became African Americans, and has always been seated. I think it's a spirit thing. I don't even think it's a logical thing. It's a guttural, instinctual thing about how much space you want to take up in the world, and whether or not you are being permitted to take up said space or not. How that translates into culture or the development of culture, I would say that, speaking from theater, any remnants of African ceremonies and procedures that were kept, whether it was language, culture that came over, but then of course English was learned, and then you'd have to go all the way back to Phyllis Wheatley, who's here. We have a dorm named after her here on campus, but she was the first published anybody to tell a story in America as a person of color. And about 2 decades later, you had William Brown, who's considered the first Black playwright to ever, be presented, known, or published. So those are the origin stories of resistance, where it comes from, where it exists, and then of course the spoken word being permitted to. Phyllis Wheatley was apparently interrogated by the court system and judges, saying that it was impossible. She could not be intellectual enough. She could not hold the asset of creativity as a Black person, let alone a Black woman, to have written those writings. They even found a white woman to say that she wrote them, so that this idea, this empowerment would not exist, that we as a people were capable of being more than, laborers.
You both have brought up so many important points, and especially the idea of names. In history, we would see so many accounts of Africans who refused to answer to a name given to them by a European, and they would get beaten for that. And even when they would flee and become freedom seekers, the owner would put an ad saying that their name is such and such, but they only go by, they refuse to acknowledge that name, and the only name they answer to, and they'll put this African name that this person had and laid claim to. And I even think about the term African Americans. We've gone from what Europeans would refer, they would basically refer to Black people as negros, Negroes, which means Black. And then African Americans would actually, at the beginning, or actually the end of the 18th century, call themselves Afro-Americans, because they wanted to acknowledge and to lay out I would say, put their foot down and say, I am both African and American. And that was something that you said, Christy. And then beyond that, even, you would see colored, to acknowledge this very mixed parentage. And then you would see Afro-American reemerge in the 20th century, and then African-American. So this concept of redefining oneself, I think, is really important. And you all also mentioned, can we go back to the previous slide? The pictures of the way that people would dress. So you see Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and others in suits and ties. in this march. And of course, it had to have been a hot day or at least a warm day, but they were insisting on wearing certain clothing. Tell me what you thought about the way they were trying to present themselves.
I wanted to say something about that. I figured I'd say it later, but that was a way of resistance through conformity, because like I said earlier, you're told you're just this or you're just that. And, the white establishment for so long had considered Blacks less than human. And they just wanted to see you as you looked in the field when you were a slave. So Martin Luther King, being very wise as he organized these marches, he had to, because he knew media, everyone's going to be there. He wanted to present the Black man and woman as they truly were. We're intelligent beings, so they're very well dressed, much more so than the folk that were throwing rocks at them and spitting on them and everything like that. But they're dressed to the nines. They have their hats on. Even the everyday people who maybe didn't have the means Martin Luther King had, they still had on clean shirts, clean button-down shirts, nice trousers. The women were dressed like they were either going to Sunday service or going to lunch. They were well dressed and presented a very well-heeled picture to the media and to their oppressors also. So it was resistance because it's saying, no, we are not what you say we are. This is who we are.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide? Because then we're going to get into some of the specifics, some of the plays. And so, Anthony, I wanted to talk with you about the kind of plays that we see. And you mentioned one of the people. I want you to talk a little bit more about one of the first plays written by an African American to talk about African Americans in American society. And I'm reminded of this playwright who said, he tries to see the brilliance of the artist instead of making a value judgment about the person in the way that he tries to depict his characters in the plays. And so what kind of plays, and I want to actually kind of reframe this question, what kind of plays really depicted this type of Black resistance even before the 20th and 21st century, some of the earlier ones, and then let's go then up to the 20th and 21st centuries to talk about some of those plays?
Well, I'm going to start off with the image in Mr. James L. James that has this quote pulled from. And I'm going to talk about the image of Martin Luther King that we just also spoke about.
Sure.
To talk about plays, so that's my automatic light in my office. Hopefully it'll turn back on. There we go. The idea of conformity as resistance is to hang around long enough, to play by the rules long enough to get the opportunity eventually to be seen, to truly be seen, to be yourself, to be seen. And in theater and its origins, as is the rest of the story of any aspect of Black African-American life in America, 100% conformity is expected to show, prove, illuminate the possibility that we could share something in common, that I am a person of color, but I too think, feel, learn, process, intellectualize just as good as you can, and that I deserve these said rights. Plays in America, like I said, it was the late 1800s when plays were starting to get prominence. But again, there's literally hundreds of plays, like anything else. I'm sure that if Christy or anybody else said that have been written, brilliant plays by the Negro Ensemble Company, even here more recently, and things of that nature. But again, it's America. There's no platform. There's no resources. Our voices are not interpreted as valid. So there is no real context to that. What the old adage of you got to be 10 times better is not just intellectual. It is appearance. You must walk in and not be threatening, and you are threatening because you are foreign, unfamiliar, or unlike. And what the theater does is disarm all of that. You go in for a night of entertainment and you're more open, and it's not a dialogue. You're forced to just receive and process. The first major play actually wasn't until, I think it was the play is called No Place to Be Somebody by Charles Gordon. It's the first play written by a person of color to win the Pulitzer Prize for drama. In terms of national standard, America, Broadway is it. We all know that. Unfortunately, that's the soonest that you get recognition in the theater. And even that was guised. It was about a bartender, a Black bartender, who was trying to sort of counter and outwit some white gangsters. But the story in its entirety is just a metaphor for Black people trying to find space, which is why it's called No Place to Be Somebody. And like I said, I think that was the 70s. I don't remember.
1969.
Yes. Well, there you go. And and it was just, that's the inception point of when America accepted a Black narrative as being able to ascend to the top. And of course, Phyllis Wheatley being the first person to organize words as art and it be published. And even then it was questioned, criticized, and rejected on the basis that she's Black and she's a woman and is incapable. Could not be possible. Let's bring her into the court because she's misrepresenting her race and confusing all of America because she wrote a poem.
Well, you know, we know what Thomas Jefferson said about Phyllis Wheatley and how, you know, even when he acknowledged that she wrote it, he had to demonize her by saying, oh, this is inferior poetry.
Yes. And in terms of voices, you have Charles Gordon as the first Pulitzer playwright, but then you have, of course, Lorraine Hansberry, but you also have Samart Williams. Yes, the Negro Ensemble Company, there they all are in their glory. The Negro Ensemble Company, the New Federal Theater, Woody King's New Federal Theater. These were all, you know, mainstays in major America's hub for theater in New York. Beautiful plays, wonderful plays, and they're just now coming back. Like they're making their Broadway debuts after almost like 100 years of existence, some of them. Not edited, not redone, not modernized. And when you put them on stage, they're just as relevant, strong, and powerful. But unfortunately, they were not given the same platform. So I bring up Phyllis Wheatley specifically to couch all of this in. To write, to speak, to do anything is Black resistance in America. To take space where none was given is resistance by default, you know. And I feel like Phyllis Wheatley was the first widely accepted inception point for that. But then you have the August Wilsons, who chronicled, you know, a whole century of Black existence. And even then, the most famous play, of course, is Fences by August Wilson. And because it was the first major one, there were producers who were not people of color who were forcing him to change his narrative, to change some of the storyline. At one point, he said that it's the play he dislikes, you know, adamantly of all of them, because he had not yet been given the power to tell his own story, even in something, you know, in the last, you know, 100 years of our artistic development. And then you have Anna Devere Smith, right? Fires in the Mirror, which was revolutionary and exciting, but was also met with controversy and was told it was too stark. And what will you do? It's like everybody else can tell their story, no matter how dramatic, traumatic. But when we tell ours, our truths are inconveniences because it reminds America of what it was. It reminds descendants of people from that lineage of what maybe their ancestors have done. But it's like the Black Lives Matter movement. To say that you matter, to want to curate and talk about where you come from is not an opposing force. But it is resistance to being to having your existence minimized, as being told essentially that your existence in the arts, as it is told in storytelling and plays and musicals and television and film, is inconvenient. We're over it. We're tired of hearing the slave narrative. But everybody else gets to celebrate their history and culture as many times and in as many stories and as many aspects, because it doesn't come with such a bitter taste here in America.
Well, I think as long as you talk about slavery from the perspective that Black people are family members and servants, and that they did not experience the horrors of rape or the horrors of beatings or of selling family members away, or simply just not being free and making choices in their lives. As long as you don't talk about those things, you just talk about the stereotypes, then it's welcome. But of course, I remind people today that we're talking about the reality, and these playwrights, these artists, they're trying to, as you say, tell their truths. Could we see the next slide? One of the truths to me is, that came from Raisin in the Sun, was this concept that migrating from the South to the North, and especially to places like New York City, would somehow be a place or a space where you receive deliverance from all of these things. But what was Lorraine Hansberry really talking about when she wrote that play? What was the sort of the takeaway that I'm sure she felt she wanted to convey to her audience?
Well, we all know that it was semi-biographical. She has said that herself. But I think that the overarching theme is that you can chase privilege whenever you want to in America at the time that she was there. And no matter how high you go, no matter what city you go to, no matter how hard you work, no matter what you sacrifice, you're still Black. And there's still a ceiling, and you will not be welcome in all circles. And even when we have our own opportunity and do all the work, we do all the work, we get it done, we cross every T, dot every I, long suffering patience, that even when you've collected all of the resources, that it doesn't matter, that you're still Black. And you want to talk about resistance, saving up that amount of money, having a family member's necessarily inheritance be a nest egg for generational wealth, where one wants to get their education and grow, the other one wants a business, the youngest one doesn't even have a bedroom, and the glory is to maybe he can have his own room. Like, it's a very clear picture that no matter how hard you work, no matter what you do, there's always a ceiling. There's always something that is going to block your access that does not exist for non-African-American Black people in America. In the play, as I see the slide about other shows, we did Raisin in the Sun my first year here. That was, I think it was fall of 2014. And it almost became the first sold out show in over 20 years. People loved the show because it was also revolutionary, not just resistant, because everybody in the play, there was no, the people we met were not crooks and criminals. They were not maids. They were not, you know, those things. And Broadway had never really seen a story like that, where, what do you mean you guys exist as a family in America? What do you mean by that? You know? And then some of the other plays that I've selected for the theater company as artistic director, it might be a random one to say, but our own permission for imagination is Black resistance. When we did our first co-production with the Virginia Stage Company of The Wiz, it did two major things. One was it took the Wells Theater, which is a historic landmark for the echoes of racism in America and having to be in the back and the top, very, very back or not permitted at all. And then The Wiz, which was the equivalent of like Black Panther at the time. This wonderful, whimsical recreation of the story of Oz with this fascination of imagination had not existed before. It just didn't exist. And then you have plays that we've done like Ruined, which is about the diasporic connection to things, about women and the treatment of how they are in the Congo. We've done play The Brother Size. We won the National Kennedy Center Awards for that particular play. And it talks about how Black men, after being incarcerated and institutionalized by society, doesn't let them have a second chance. The idea is that you are always a criminal. You were just let free, and that there is no such thing as reform, that you are always to be watched and monitored, that there is no place where people think that you can live a better life and become a better person as a Black man in America. We've done For Colored Girls, which was also, like Miss Wheatley, a book of poetry first. It caught the eye of Oscar Eustis at the Public Theater and became a play. But at the time, it was the only play ever done. And unfortunately, sadly, is probably like, maybe there are like 4 more that are all Black female casts speaking of the Black female experience in America. There's not much that we have done in the theater company that does not lend itself to that. We partnered with the stage company on another production called The Earth Remembers, and it was literally exclusively about resistance in the state of Virginia, and people fighting to make more space for themselves, and those stories and how those things occurred. So essentially, if you ask me this question, anytime you speak a Black narrative, it is essentially resistance to the idea of not having space, of not having a platform. I'll bring up Tyler Perry. We have not done his plays, but when he first came out, all the studios laughed, mocked him, told him, what is he going? Even when they saw the financial figures, because culturally, they could not connect. They did not understand where all of these narratives and stories were coming from. But Saturday Night Live comedy sketches were hits. Adam Sandler had a chain, Jim Carrey, I mean, just farcical almost movies. But Black people do it for themselves, and it's just not respected and regarded. But we show up at the box office for his movies, for his plays, because it's like, oh my God, this feels way more familiar than anything that is on television right now. We just, this past Saturday, we were selected for the Kennedy Center officially, and it was for a play called Thoughts of a Colored Man, which was inspired by For Colored Girls. The playwright read For Colored Girls at a PWI. He had never even known that narratives could exist like that. It took him 15 years to write it, rewrite it, edit it, but it opened Broadway after the pandemic, and it too is a play, even today in 2021, telling new narratives on stage that have never been told before. Not revolutionary, not so very modern that, you know, it took technology and a new decade or an era to come to. Just real people, unfiltered, not being couched, catered to, or refined for broad mainstream America popularity. So I would say all of what we do is in its essentially resistance, but some of the best stories that we tell as a people are surrounded around that, because that's a part of who we are as a people. Yes, we have love. Yes, we have comedy. We have all those things, and we do those things too. But it's definitely narratives that speak to expanding the understanding of who we are and where we come from. Lady Day Emerson's Bar and Grill, about Billie Holiday and her story, her life as a musician, and how she had to go through you know, the quintessential backdoor kitchen eating, no bathroom for you, you're not welcomed here stories, but you're such an amazing talent. So we will let you stand on stage and entertain us, which has been the history of African Americans for so long in this country.
So, what you're talking about is so critical to what I would say every aspect of African American history and culture is all about. And that really kind of leads me to wanting to talk briefly about fashion. And I really want the two of you to uh, uh, kind of feed off of each other with a lot of the issues, because it's pretty much the same thing. Anthony, as you said, all of what you see in Black plays and performance is a form of resistance, because it's the counter to the narrative that pretty much white society has presented of African Americans. This idea that African Americans don't feel pain the way the white people feel pain. They don't think the way that white people think, that they are inferior, that they're savages, that they're brutes, that they are living only to please white people. Those are the things that comforted American society, that made white Americans, feel okay with slavery, okay with the disconnect between saying that this nation was about freedom and liberty while also enslaving people. And so every aspect of Black people telling their own stories was a form of resistance. And so, Christy,
Yes.
how has fashion really been used to depict resistance?
Well, for that, I'm going to start with probably a not so well-known name, but the catalyst, I believe, for high fashion as far as Black designers go. And that would be a once enslaved woman, Elizabeth Keckley, whom, and I would imagine she did dressmaking on the plantation, because once she freed herself from the plantation, she went on to become what they would call a seamstress, but she really was doing couture level designing for very important people, such as Mary Todd Lincoln. She wound up from the plantation to the White House. She was Mary Lincoln's personal dressmaker, which also made her very popular with other senators or whatever wives in wanting the latest fashion. At that time, there was no Vogue magazine or anything like that. So they used fashion dolls that traveled by boat from Paris to the States. And that's how they knew what the latest fashions were. Well, the slaves that did the dressmaking had to, from those dolls, do full scale replicas of those dresses. Elizabeth Keckley saw that as her way to resist, no longer having to be a slave or being under someone's thumb. She was making her own money. She was able to carve out a good living for herself doing this, but she also put Blacks in a whole nother arena. Yes, we were always the seamstresses, the dressmakers or whatever, but never thought of as designers or someone who could do this type of thing and make a real living out of it. So from Elizabeth Keckley, who lived a very hard life, she had and people say a mean slave owner, every slave owner was mean and abhorrent, but hers beat her excessively, and she kept trying to escape. Once she finally was able to be free from him, like I said, she went on to make a living for herself. doing dressmaking and designing for very high-powered people. And it's been said that she was probably Mary Todd Lincoln's #1 confidant. But also with her, I would move on to Anne Lowe, who, again, not so well known in the Black fashion circles, yes, and even white fashion circles, because you can't deny what is proven. But she designed the wedding gown and created for Jackie Kennedy, and along with that, her name is always used in that connection, that she did Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. But she also designed for Dinah Washington, for Dorothy Dandridge, for Olivia de Havilland. She dressed the top tier in Hollywood, both Black and white, because she was a couturier. Even though she was American, her technical skills rivaled that of Jean Lanvin, Paquin, these French designers who were sanctioned by La Chambre de Syndicale. So they're true couturiers, but her level of excellence in her dressmaking was couture level. So you have women like that who their resistance was proving not only, as Professor Stockard was saying, that we are thinking people, we are talented people, our work rivals your work, because like you said, you had to be 10 times better. But she had a seat somewhat at the table for inside Hollywood, yet because she was Black, you would not see her in the same circles as Edith Head, who had more Oscars for costume design of any other costume design in history. But her work was just as fine, if not better. So from there, you see these, and I find it interesting that they're both women, but because the fashion industry for so long has been a white male driven industry. But here at the beginning, there were Black females who sort of spearheaded putting African Americans into that arena. And you can move on to the next image. I put this image here because earlier we talked about how Martin Luther King and his freedom marchers dressed very well heeled, and even though it was hot weather and a lot of times and things like that, around the mid to later 60s and even in the early 60s, there were some freedom marchers who started to adopt denim more so than these suits, because we know from news footage, a lot of times they were met by police dogs, fire hoses, and it was ruining their good suits. And if you don't have 10 or 15 suits in your closet and you ruin your only good suit, that's a high price to pay. So they started wearing denim because it was thicker, it was more resistance to the attacks that they faced. So they could just wash it and get ready for the next protest. Also, and as it says, April of 1962 in Huntsville, Alabama, the whole city, and meaning the Blacks and those who supported their resistance, decided to boycott the retailers because, this was true even here in Tidewater in Norfolk, downtown Norfolk, there were certain retailers and stores, if you were Black, you could shop there, but you couldn't use their restroom facilities, you could not work there. And for the women, and we all know in the Black church and Black women, period, especially in the 60s, you wore a hat. That was, a woman wasn't fully dressed without her hat. But in those stores, you couldn't try the hats on. You just had to imagine it would work for you. But they decided to protest. And that Easter Instead of shopping for their Sunday best, they decided to, instead of Easter Sunday, it was Blue Jean Sunday. And it's estimated that the retailers lost over $1 million in that boycott, and things started to change. They said Huntsville was sort of at the forefront of making changes to stop a lot of the oppression that was going on for Blacks during that time. But it was because when you hit them in the wallet, just like the bus boycotts and all of those things, they have to pay attention. So the Blacks who were marching started wearing denim. Also, it helped them identify with the oppressed, with the field hand workers and things like that, because although slavery was over, there was still sharecropping going on. There were still Blacks laboring in fields, and they historically wore denim. Next image. I put certain images in because they are so symbolic of fashion and Black resistance. And the Black Panther Party, what could be more symbolic of that? And they wore a uniform of sorts because they wanted to be able to identify each other. And many people dressed like them because they wanted to identify with the resistance. The Black berets, the safari-styled long line jackets, leather jackets, the black or dark turtleneck sweaters, these wide neck collared shirts. You know, the traditional collared shirt had a much smaller collar, but this was more defiant, more radical. Then the bell-bottom jeans and pants. Bell bottoms were again something that was worn that sort of went against the establishment, because during the early mid 60s, pants were very tapered. But as they started to flare, started to spread, the Black Power movement, even the Flower Child hippie movement sort of gravitated to the bell bottoms.
Christy, I wanted to kind of insert one thing. I love how you talk about fashion as a way of protest, and using the Black Panthers as an example. And one of the things, one element that is left off of this is something you talk about a little later, and that is the hairstyles.
Yes.
Because with the Black Panthers, you would always see the big afro. And that was a key element. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that, and maybe go to the next slide.
Sure. And the afro, again, the head of the Black Panther movement, Huey Newton, in the long line leather jacket. Those two elements, since you mentioned it, the afro and that long line leather jacket, I can remember by the early 70s, my dad had an afro and he wore a leather jacket. It eventually moved into the mainstream, but the afro, yes, it was very much resistance, because as Professor Stockard was saying, you had to sort of assimilate and not stand out, yet you wanted to stand out in your talent or whatever. But the afro was embracing your hair's natural pattern and letting it grow. And, you know, quite often white society would become very intimidated by afros because, number one, it's foreign to them. Number two, this Black person is doing what they want to do. You know, they're thinking and they've decided, no, I don't want to cut my hair, or even worse, in the 40s and 50s, I don't want to process my hair, which was a means of boiling potatoes or whatever, and you made this lye substance, put it in your hair, and you're basically baking your scalp, but it would straighten the hair so that their hair mirrored white society. But they had to continue to do that in order to keep the hair straight, much like women and relaxers. You know, at one point, it was not a choice. It was, if you wanted this job, you knew you were going to have to do something to make you less threatening. Well, with the Black Panther Party, the whole point was to embrace your Blackness. And as I was researching, they even said they named themselves the Black Panther because of the characteristics of the Panther. They said, you know, if something approaches them, they will first back away, you know, or try to go their own way. But if they continue to come after them, then they attack. So it was a movement that was not so much about violence, because they did a lot of good for the Black community with Head Start and breakfast programs and things like that. But it was, we're not going to be pushed around anymore, so to speak. The image with the women, women's liberation and the women's movement, Black women played a large role in that, as well as in the Black Panther movement. You can think of Angela Davis. But again, we see the afros and then these head wraps that are very inspired by the gele wraps of African countries. So,
You know, I like how you put that emphasis on head wraps. You know, white society had this very stereotypic image of a more European style handkerchief on their heads. But in reality, many African American women, even during the antebellum period, did not wear head scarves like that. They wore head wraps. Can you tell us a little bit of the difference between a handkerchief on your head and a head wrap?
most definitely, a handkerchief on your head is simply that. You know, sometimes if a woman had little pin curls or whatever clamps in their hair, they'd put a scarf on to run to the grocery store or whatever, just to keep the wind out of their hair. A head wrap or gele wrap is a work of art. It sort of sets you apart almost as a queen, the queen of your house. Your husband's the king, you are the queen. They're very highly revered in African culture and very intricate designs. You know, you don't just wrap it up in 3 seconds and you go. There's a method to it. It's almost, and I would almost liken it to origami, if you will, because each one can be symbolic of something different about that woman. If we want to really get deep into detail of it, there's certain gele wraps for a woman who is the matriarch, for a mother, a woman who has children, for a single woman as opposed to a married woman. So it's a very prominent head wearing for women.
So in other words, it's an indicator of what status you were seen as having within that society.
Exactly, an indicator of status. And as we said earlier, we had to research Africa and these different African countries to even know that. You know, they're all cultures. Even ancient Rome had different status symbols for married women or women of politicians, as opposed to single women or someone who, you know, is of a lesser status. So yes, the gele wraps could identify you as what level in society or what status in society you would hold.
So let's go
I wanted
to
to throw in there before we move and we talk about fashion and hair. I mean, even today, right? All the news articles about young Black men who aren't allowed to even go to their own graduation. You can go to high school, you can go to class, but you can't walk because you have locks in your hair. You know, valedictorians who were denied graduation and graduation speeches, transferring to other school districts, even to today, just like segregation, just so that they could walk and participate in graduation. And
Exactly.
again, all a part of fashion and culture.
Mhm. And it's because people are afraid of what they're not used to. This image, beautiful young Black females in these very Afrocentric styles. And, you know, this one I would date at somewhere early mid 70s with the mini skirts. Could even be late 60s. But each of them wearing some form of a waxed African print cotton or something that has an Afrocentric look to it. The men in dashiki type shirts, because this was very big in the 60s. Mainstream Black youth on college campuses, you know, they wear the dashikis. If many dresses were in for the mainstream, but the African fabric put a different twist to it. There was always a way, or we had a way of making it unique to our culture. You know, I'm the youngest of five. I had three, well, yeah, I had three older sisters and a cousin that lived with us. But watching them in their teen years, they each had a style of dress and they added something to it that when they went to school and they came in high school, my two younger sisters, meaning the youngest of the older ones, they were there right at desegregation. They were wearing the same styles as their white counterparts, but there was always a little different styling to it that made it unique to the culture. And then if you had very soft hair, you could still slick your hair and buy an Afro puff and put a puff on it. Or if you had really short hair, there were Afro wigs, you know, so you still could purchase or make something that would help you fit in with the Black youth culture in fashion and in style. And the huge hoop earrings, the wide choker necklaces that went back to the types of neck pieces that they wore in Africa.
So in essence, what you're really saying is that fashion and hair and even the way in which you would wear that clothing, that this is all a part of the Black aesthetic. This is all a part of Black resistance. And what I found interesting is that that the white fashion designers began to label these types of patterns as primitive patterns. So even as they were branching out and pushing this product that had its roots and origins in Africa, white society was still trying to demonize it, denigrate it in some way, labeling it primitive. I was wondering what kind of pushback has occurred among Black fashion designers to that type of labeling?
Well, as recently as I would say the past 4 or 5 years, there was a French couture designer, and I'm trying to remember if it was Balenciaga or it may have been Prada. Either way, they had an ad campaign for these sweaters, and on the sweater there was this sort of Jemima-ish type face on it, Black face, big red lips, and you know, this little curl of hair on the top of the head. And it almost had, because of the ears, monkey-like a monkey-like image to it. And there was fallout all over the fashion industry for that. And they, you know, said, okay, Prada, thank you. They sent apologies. Oh no, that's not what we meant, and this and that. But especially after Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and the Black Lives Matter movement happened, a lot of companies have started looking at what they do and how they've done it in the past, and starting to realize whether it's only for sake of dollars or they truly have had an aha moment that, okay, all this that we thought was cool for all these decades, it was never cool. It was never right to do. And Blacks have started to use their buying power as much like they did in the boycotts in the 60s to understand, okay, yeah, we do have power. We can say, I'm not buying that. And if our white counterparts, because when we talk about resistance and freedom movement, there were quite a few whites out there marching as well as Blacks for the freedom. If they say we're not going to buy it, and this is the age of, you know, we will just have you wiped out. We will say, you know, we are not using that, or we're not buying from them, and your business can go out of business. The cancel culture is what they're calling it. So yes, there has been fallout. There was another ad campaign, and it had children's wear. This was again a European company, and they had little slogans for each kid. And on the slogan with the Black child who was on a playground, it said something like, "Coolest monkey in the zoo." Why was that not on the little white boy sweater? You know, so things like that. Yes, it's still happening. It's going to happen as long as racism is happening. But because of the unknown sacrifice that Trayvon Martin made with his life, and George Floyd with his life, we have now been able to not only get seats at tables that we weren't welcome at, you know, years ago, but we've been able to build our own tables. Virgil Abloh was the first Black designer or designer of color to head a major couture house, which was Louis Vuitton. And he started before that his own couture level fashion house called Off-White. But he's one who, and he died very young of cancer, but he is one who blew the doors open for Black designers to realize, yes, you not only can make it here in America, you can go to Europe and do very well. Now Louis Vuitton has Pharrell Williams as their creative director for their menswear brand.
So let's see some of these slides that you've pulled together. And let's talk about them briefly, because I know we are about to run out of time. So
I'll do this real quick. Okay. Run DMC, one for fashion, they're best known for making the tracksuit and the whole idea of Adidas cool with young Black culture. Their song, My Adidas and Me, made Adidas sales skyrocket. At this point, the hip hop culture made a lasting impact on fashion, because before that, sneakers were something you wore on the basketball court or on, you know, to play in the backyard. But now they became a status symbol. Air Jordan, which they were designed by Dwayne Edwards, who started Pencil Lewis College for Black creatives. Air Jordans will be here forever. You know, this has become a classic, and people will wait in line for literally hours to be the first to buy the newest Air Jordan, because they know once it's gone, it's gone. And some of them they don't even wear, they just collect. You can go on to the next one. Salt and Pepper, in the mid-late 80s, they were one of the fashion plate groups for young Black females in America. And I always say, you know, I was teaching at Norfolk State at this time in the mid-90s. You could always tell who the students were listening to music-wise by the way they dressed, because they either emulated the hairstyles. Here was Salt and Pepper with the asymmetrical haircut, the kente cloth accessories, and these bold varsity jackets with the big patches on it. That was something else that the Black hip hop culture put into mainstream society. Those jackets are now collector's items. Or it was Erykah Badu with the tall head wraps and the large earrings. Here we have Pharrell Williams, who, like I said, is the new creative director for menswear at Louis Vuitton. And he started out in the skateboard culture, Virgil Abloh. And if you look at his designs, there is a hip hopness to them, and that they're oversized, you know, even the women and the men's oversized, baggy, the bell bottoms. He brought a taste of African American inspired style to French couture. Next. Stephen Burrows. I want to mention this year was the 50th anniversary of hip hop, as well as the 50th anniversary of something called the Battle at Versailles. And that was when 5 American designers went to France and sort of faced off with, I think it was maybe 8 French couture designers. And the whole thing was a fundraiser to help preserve the Castle of Versailles, because it was really in bad repair and so forth. Stephen Burrows was the designer who literally brought the house down. They had never seen such beautiful Black bodies. First of all, he used all Black models, but the colors that he used, and you can see in this dress here, these very, and I would say Afrocentric colors, because they're very bold and colors you would not necessarily think would work together, but they do. And his clothing was very form-fitting to the waist and the bust. And his portion of the show just sent, the model said it basically sent the French people almost into hysterics. They loved it so much. At the end, Yves Saint Laurent said the only true fashion he saw from the American side was in Stephen Burrows. Burrows not only gave the French audience a taste of African American style, but he also helped open the door for Black models to be used on the European runways.
And so I want to just kind of give each of you just a couple of minutes to just answer this particular question about how you work. For you, Christy, in Black fashion, for you, Anthony, in Black theater. You know, how have you tried in your personal work, in your teaching, to examine these issues? Chrissy, why don't you answer that, and then we will conclude with Anthony.
All right. The first thing I did when I first started teaching at State, and I still do it, is I make the students research Black designers as well as European designers, because I tell them, in order to do something, you need to know about it. You need to know its history. And I also ask them the question of, who do you see yourself as a designer? Where do you see that you fit in? I try to expose them to Blacks within the industry that are holding positions that they would once they graduate, they eventually would like to hold themselves. We had Ruth Carter come in and speak to the students, because her niece was actually one of my fashion students, Yolanda Carter. Yolanda was her assistant costume designer on Amistad. Along with that, I've taken students not only to the Harlem's Fashion Row HBCU Student Forum, but we got to go to the exhibition 50 Years of Hip Hop at FIT's museum. So they got to see actual garments that these people they consider icons wore, and see the Black style that was put together. They had everything from the gold chains, the rings, the earrings Queen Latifah wore, all these types of things there. So I think exposure to Blacks who are doing fashion that dealt with resistance, and bringing those people in to speak to them is one of the things I try to do to help them, as the future of fashion, understand what it is you're treading into, and the history of it, and how are you going to build the future of it.
Thank you so much. Anthony.
This is a great question. It's actually the center of my research. It's the center of my teaching methodology. Unlike a lot of other academic disciplines where you can teach, English, math, whatever it is, and you might be a person of color, in performance and in design, many students in theater go to non-HBCUs, and because of the literal demographic, they do all stories primarily that speak to the non-African American existence. And that's the big difference at a HBCU. It's a very unique academic differentiation between majoring in many things and majoring in something like performance. All I do every day is teach Black resistance. Literally, we find the plays that they are leads in. I teach them to embrace themselves and who they are, and that they don't have to train to become the other first to tell their stories, and then hope one day to tell their own. They're trained to be storytellers. They're trained to create their own work, to tell their own narratives. In acting, you're cast because you look a certain way. You have a certain vibe, you have a certain skill set, and you come into the room as a person of color, as an African American, and I encourage them from day one that is never to be diminished, to be something that is a discouraging point of existence. Again, in the last 10 years, the amount of diverse programming on television, film, theater has exponentially increased. So the irony is that if you have in the last 20 years been taught to try to be mainstream American familiar, or act and perform in ways that might be untrue or other than your own cultural exercise in this country, to conform, to be able to get more work, to the whole thing of conformity for resistance, that's actually starting to backfire. The narrative for Black narratives are being controlled by Black people, or people who will give people space to be authentically themselves, in all walks of being a person of color. So even in acting, perhaps especially in acting, Black resistance is walking into the room and saying that these are my cultural accoutrements, and they are worthy of storytelling. And I hope that you're mature enough and expansive enough in your reality of everyone who exists in this world, that there's a place for me in your stories as well. Or I'm gonna go make my own story and let you go listen to that, for those who appreciate those things. Even in technical theater, in film and television and theater, Black skin, it's scientific. The lighter the surface, the closer to pure white, the more white balance. The closer to Black, the less. And even learning how to light people of color, people who have mid-level dark tones, melanated Americans, learning the difference, and that there are traditional colors in American theater, and traditional approaches in film and television, but they do not apply to Black skin. We're doing Color Purple in the spring, so I was revisiting all the documentaries and doing research from the book and from the movie just to refresh myself. And what is his name? The director from the film, the original.
Spielberg?
Yes,
Steven
Spielberg. He told his photographer and his AD, and he listened to his people. He was like, I don't want to see eyeballs and teeth. He said, please light these people so that they can be seen. Not only did they change the lighting for it, if you look in The Color Purple, although it's very moody and appropriate to the film, all of the backgrounds are dark so that the brown skin can pop, so that they are not bright surfaces where there's this neon banner behind people. And at that time, that was an ally of revolutionary resistance in Spielberg, but a cast that told him the truth. He let them guide him in understanding it. And now here we are, December, we're going to get a new Color Purple with a Black African male directing it. And the entire cast just says that the entire experience was so wild. Even Oprah, who has context of both, is just saying how wildly refreshing it is to see the story told when there is zero filter, when there's no need for translation of culture amongst the storytellers. So my work, day in and day out, is about empowering them to be themselves, love themselves, acknowledge that they matter, that their stories are important, that they are not important because it's exceptionally told. It's because we existed that we deserve the right to tell our stories like everybody else.
Exactly.
You know, I have to say, I am especially honored to have moderated this session with two incredibly talented individuals who are passionate about their fields, who have just engaged us with information that's typically not discussed, and especially in public spaces. And I want to encourage the two of you to consider coming back, because next year it's going to be all about
Yes.
Black arts and culture as part of the Black History Month theme. And I truly believe that having these kinds of conversations that are educational and enlightening are critical to us moving forward as a society. There's so much about what Blacks have contributed that has been appropriated by white society. When you think about music, for example, what defines American music is not just jazz, it's American music. And people don't understand that American music is so much of African and African-American music. It was the Black musicians who played at most of the parties, and they helped to define how we think of music. That's why in American society, everybody line dances. And line dancing is not a European style, it's an African style. And so I think it's really important that we move away from how people's artistic contributions have been appropriated and to restore them back to the originators. And with that, I don't know if we have any time for questions from the audience, but with that, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Stephanie with a drop mic.
Yeah, we have like
Hand
2
over.
minutes. We did have one comment more than a question, but we have one of our audience members, Myra Hamlet, who just finished her MFA thesis on the history of positive imagery of Black women in clothing from 1971 to 2020. And so she said she was particularly excited to hear this presentation and extends her thanks. Myra, that sounds like a really interesting topic, and congratulations, 2020. Probably, the MFA completing graduate degree is always tough, and that 3 years ago is not all that long. But yes, thank you.
It just feels that
Just
long.
feels that long. So thank you. So this recording, just like all of our previous ones, will be available on YouTube within a day or two. I will send out the link to everyone who attended as soon as I get it posted. So it should be all, you'll get an email from me within the next couple of days. And please stay tuned. We are working on dates for next year's activities. And as Hillary and Cassandra have reminded us, next year's theme is the arts in general. So it should be a really wonderful, engaging, and very different than our previous rounds, which were often quite academic or medical in focus, but we have some the opportunity to hopefully talk about art, look at art, listen to art, but maybe even make some art together next year. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day, and happy holidays to all. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.